Hey listeners, my name is Kay, and this is Dark Tales from the Road. Hey friends, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited. I'm always excited about each episode, it seems like. But today we're going to be heading to New Mexico. We're going to hit the city of Albuquerque, and we are going to explore the folklore of La Llorona. I am fascinated by her, and there are so many stories about who she is and what happened to her, plus so many stories of encounters with her. So I'm so excited for this one. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to do a little bit of history of New Mexico because it's fascinating. I have only driven through New Mexico, so I don't know very much, and I learned a ton. And then we'll look at Albuquerque. I just have a small snippet for that one, and then hop right into our subject, and I have lots of stories about it too. So, New Mexico, they believe that it was actually occupied by humans all the way back to the Ice Age, which was 20,000 years ago. And that's when people had come across the Bering Strait. And then the Spanish came into the area and they met all the Native Americans that lived there, and they named these settlements pueblos, which means village. So then, huge time jump here, between 200 and 1300 was when the Navajo came into the area and really brought with them a very rich culture. And that was, they think, around 900. It's very weird saying that, you know? And then the Apache arrived in New Mexico around 1300. And of course, as we've seen in every state, we've almost hit 50 now, Spanish and the American settlers with the indigenous people led to extreme conflict. And most of the deaths were of the indigenous people, and of course, they lost their land. In 1680, there was actually a Pueblo revolt, and it was one of the most successful uprisings of a Native American against the colonists in North America. In the 17th century, Spanish missionaries started to come in and trying to convert the Pueblo and other indigenous people to Christianity, and it was actually sanctioned by the Spanish government. And then the Spanish settlers also started forced labor of the indigenous people. Like, they took them on as slaves pretty much. And the indigenous people population declined dramatically. There was so much violence, famine, and again, disease. So by the beginning of the 17th century, their population was about 80,000. And by the end of it, it was 17,000. It's so sad. The Apache in the area, they decided to fight against the Spanish because they were forcefully pushing the Native Americans out and pushing them onto reservations in the 19th century. So it was famously led by an Apache leader named Geronimo. They fought for 30 years to protect their homeland, and then they had to surrender in 1886, and that was called the Indian Wars in the American Southwest. In the 1860s, then came a lot of American settlers from Europe that started to come into the Navajo territory. And this was led by Lieutenant Colonel Kit Carson, and he literally led his people in this campaign to eradicate the Navajo, to kill their homeland, burn their villages, kill their livestock, and then remove them from their water sources until the Navajo surrendered. So by 1864, his troops pushed out more than 80,000 Navajo people from Arizona and New Mexico, and they would make them ride or walk more than 300 miles to a reservation near Fort Sumter, New Mexico. They called this the Long Walk. because it just death, so much death that they think about 300 Navajo actually died because of starvation and exposure. But today there are 23 federally recognized Native American tribes in New Mexico. The 19th century comes and the Mexican independence is starting to come into play. The Spanish colonists are struggling. So then came the Mexican War of Independence in 1810. By 1821, that's when Mexico gained independence from Spain and New Mexico became a part of Mexico. 1846 is when the Mexican-American War began with the United States because they declared war on Mexico to dispute the Texas boundary. It ended in 2 years later with America winning. So under this treaty that they put together with Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States paid Mexico $15 million in exchange for 525,000 square miles of land. Today's money, that is $580 million. That is a huge chunk of change. And then in 1854, the U.S. came back and paid Mexico an additional $10 million for 29,000 square miles of land. And that is what became of New Mexico and Arizona. $10 million in 1854 is $360 million. Like huge, huge chunks of change. But this is kind of what started in America, the concept of manifest destiny. So as New Mexico becomes a part of the U.S., they said, hey, we'll just join Arizona. We'll be one state. But the Arizona voters said no. And then January 6th, 1912, New Mexico was admitted to the Union as the 47th state. So World War II, New Mexico is a huge part of it. Huge. In New Mexico, there's a huge military presence. And they were trying to establish a code language to help transmit messages around where the enemy could not understand, could not decipher what they were saying. They decided on the Navajo language because at that time, fewer than 30 Navajos in New Mexico and Arizona spoke the language. And that was because of the Americans put in this policy where the Navajo and other indigenous people in the area, they were forced to assimilate to what was happening culturally, everything that was going on. So a lot of people lost their language. So there was a huge portion of Navajo code talkers. They attended training camp in 1942. There ended up being over 400 of them that got deployed throughout the war all over. Especially they were in the Pacific, and the code was never broken by the enemy forces. There is a movie, I think it's called Code Talkers. It's so good if you haven't seen it and want a little more background. When the bombing of Pearl Harbor happened, President Franklin Roosevelt, he signed an executive order declaring that the Western United States is a quote-unquote war zone. And this is when internment camps started to pop up, and people being put into them were of Japanese ancestry. There were actually 3 that were created in Mexico, and between 1942 and 1946, there were almost 5,000 Japanese Americans that were interred at the camp, which was in Santa Fe. July 16th, 1945 was the first atomic bomb testing. It was at it says the Trinity site in central New Mexico, and it was created by the Manhattan Project, where they were commissioned to build a nuclear weapon. And this was because they received intelligence that Germany was also building an atomic bomb. And residents could actually see the explosion as far as 200 miles away because it was an 18.6 kiloton explosion. With that, a lot of things drive the tourism in New Mexico is kind of my last point about it. Like Roswell, New Mexico is a tourist destination. If you haven't heard of it, there was a farmer rancher who found debris and what he thought were alien bodies out in his pasture. This was in 1947. So people are very interested in extraterrestrials. But the Air Force actually, they claimed it was a weather balloon. And then in 1997, they released a report on Roswell and said that the alien bodies were actually government test dummies to improve pilots' chances for survival when falling from high altitudes. There's a ton of documentaries, podcasts, so much information about Roswell. If that piques your interest, definitely go check it out. All right, let's jump to Albuquerque. I'm so excited to get to the subject, so let's just jump in. So, Albuquerque was a huge site for the Native American pueblos, the villages, and then Europeans arrived in about 1540 and then was founded in 1706. It was named after the Duke of Albuquerque, which then was the Viceroy of New Spain. And it was an extremely important trading center along the Chihuahua Trail from Mexico. I hope I said that right. Santa Fe is actually the state capital, but Albuquerque is the largest city, and it really thrives on military and high technology sectors. The population really, really grew when workers and immigrants came to town. It was incorporated as a town in 1885, but then by 1891, it had become a full city. In like the 1900s, there came the quote-unquote health seekers because of tuberculosis and other pulmonary diseases. People just flocked to Albuquerque, and there's a ton of hospitals also there that were built by the government. There's still a massive U.S. government presence there because in the 1930s, more than 100 federal agencies put up their offices in the city. New Mexico is very diverse. They have, they're big in industry, military bases, laboratories, and they actually have a nickname called quote unquote Little Washington because there's Kirkland Air Force Base there. It was built in 1942, and it was a huge part of the testing ground for different weapons, including some nuclear weapons. And it aids in the process of uranium, and that's actually mined in Colorado and then brought there. And it was actually considered as a target during the Cold War to be bombed with a nuclear bomb because of the Soviet Union. Very crazy. Now they really focus on solar energy, computer equipment, but it's still very heavily relied upon the federal and military presence there. So I didn't want to repeat a ton of the history from New Mexico because it's very similar. So Albuquerque was just a little tidbit there. I really want to talk about La Llorona. She's interesting, and there's so many different stories. I'm just so pumped for this. Let's get started, guys. So most people in New Mexico, if not all over, have heard of La Llorona. She is said to be a very tall, slender woman with dark hair dressed in white. It is said that people see her weeping by the rivers and streams throughout New Mexico. There are so many variations to her story. It's insane. But here, this is kind of the general story. At the, center of all of it is that she was wronged by a man and drowned her own children. So then she walks along the waterways, luring children in and drowning them. I'm so sorry. That's very sad. And so she's usually seen around the Rio Grande, which is in Albuquerque. And her story has evolved so much that communities will use it as a children's story to encourage children not to wander off, not to go out in the dark, and to not go near bodies of water. So the history of La Llorona is massive, and it goes way back. They associate a lot of it with the early colonial times. That's actually pre-Hispanic, and then it really started becoming associated with the Spanish, the indigenous, and still kind of in the colonial area. The most common thing about her is that she's an indigenous woman who murdered her own children, and she was wed to a wealthy Spaniard, and he abandoned her. And so they look at her like a villain, and they see these qualities of infanticide and murdering one's own blood. It's very sad. And so La Llorona is very well known in like Mexico and southwestern United States. The earliest documentation of her can be traced back to 1550 in Mexico City, and they believe that she may be connected to Aztec mythology. There's an example called, quote, the hungry woman, and it's a wailing woman who's crying constantly for food, and they compare La Llorona to that because of the wailing for her children. And there are a ton of these. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. And her story can also be found in like Central America and South America. She's also compared to Eve and Lilith of Hebrew mythology because they are weeping female phantoms in their folklore. She's also been compared to a German folk tale. I can't say it, but it was from 1486. She's associated with so many different things. That's why it's kind of cool. It's not just the story of a weeping woman. She's compared in different cultures and locations, and her story changes into this and that, and people see her differently. So that's what I really like about it. Because they also compare her to a Greek tale of a demigoddess named Lamia, and Hera, Zeus's wife, learned that Zeus had an affair with Lamia and killed all of the children that Lamia had with Zeus. So out of jealousy, Lamia now kills other women's children. So La Llorona is associated with her. They have also said her name is Rosalia, and she's a ghost woman who was murdered by her husband. But another one is a woman named Maria. She marries a rich conquistador and has 2 children. Then Maria sees her husband with another woman, and in complete rage, she drowns her children in a river, then immediately regrets that. So since she can't save them, she is consumed by guilt and drowns herself as well. But she's unable to enter the afterlife. She is forced to be in purgatory and roam the earth until she finds her children. Another version is that her children were illegitimate, and she drowns them so that the father cannot take them away to be raised by his new wife. And so, like, continuing variations, she's in a white dress, she's in a wet dress, she's nocturnally wailing, and tons of association with water. In Guatemala City, there's a local legend that a woman had an affair with her lover. She became pregnant and gave birth to the child and named him Juan de la Cruz, who she drowned so her husband wouldn't know. So again, she was condemned to the afterlife, searching for her murdered son in places where there's pools of water. And she cries out for him, hence her being named the Wailing Woman. So it's a very popular legend, but it's very scary legend. And they are passed down from generation to generation. And people claim that they hear her say, quote, "Oh, my children," when talking about this story. Another detail is that if you hear the cry from afar, that means the ghost is nearby. But if the cry is heard nearby, it means the ghost is afar. And so if you are able to face her, you will be quote unquote won over to the afterlife and never be seen again. Whew! There is a text, it's called the Florentine Codex, that came from Mexico in like 1519. And there's a quote from it that says, quote, "The sixth omen was that many times a woman would be heard going along weeping and shouting. She cried out loudly at the night, saying, 'Oh, my children, we are about to go forever.' Sometimes she said, 'Oh, my children, where am I to take you?'" And another one is in Venezuela. The families actually will place a wooden cross above their doors to ward off spirits. So I have an article here that I want to, I know I do this read for word, but this one, it was a lot longer. I took the history part out because we've been over it. It was all repeated. So these are just kind of more stories. So this is called La Llorona, an introduction to the Weeping Woman. It was posted October 13th of 2021 by a man named Stephen, whatever, Winnick. So it's a series of blog posts, but I do have the link in my show notes if you'd like to look at that. So, quote, "A diverse array of La Llorona stories can be found in news accounts across the internet. You can also find many collected in the book The Weeping Woman, Encounters with La Llorona by Edward Garcia Crowell and Judith Beatty. Looking through such stories, you'll find many variations. Sometimes La Llorona sees you from afar and pursues you, terrifying you as you flee toward your home. Sometimes she appears riding a horse. Sometimes she appears in your horse-drawn wagon or in your car, warning you against bad behavior before disappearing. Just like that, other famous spirit, the vanishing hitchhiker. In some stories, an encounter with her is fatal. One source is Bess Lomax Hawes' classic paper, La Llorona in Juvenile Hall, which is an account and interpretation of stories about La Llorona circulating in a juvenile detention center in California in the 1960s. Hawes' paper provided a variety of views on La Llorona, including the young woman's stories, her review of other scholars' work, and her own interpretations. In the essay, Hawes described the many faces, literal and figurative, worn by La Llorona. La Llorona typically appears as a malevolent spirit, either a harbinger or a direct cause of misfortune to the living. Sometimes she takes the form of a dangerous siren, tempting a solitary male late at night by confronting him as a pitiful, woe-begone figure hidden under a rebozo. When offered assistance, she turns on the solicitous gentleman the face of a skeleton or a wild, metallic horse's head, or no face at all. Sometimes she is observed simply roaming about at a distance, or most typically, she heard weeping and shrieking throughout the night. A chance meeting with her is dangerous. Hawes also provided a verbatim transcripts from children in juvenile detention. Here's a typical example. La Llorona has long hair and walks around crying. I heard from the counselors at juvie that she had 2 kids that she drowned because they were bad. She drowned them in Tijuana. She attacked bad kids in juvie. They say it is true. Another adds more gruesome detail. It is a woman who wasn't quite all there who killed her 3 girls, 13 to 17 years old. She didn't want them because something had happened to her husband and they reminded her of him, so she drowned them. Their bones are buried in her back. She doesn't know they are dead. She wears a long black cape with a peaked hood and goes around institutions and foster homes looking for kids. If she sees a girl who looks like one of her daughters, she tries to cut out that feature. She comes around 3 days after it rains. Ah! So, an interview was published by Thomas Albone Janvier in 1906 in Harper's Magazine and was reprinted in many newspapers, including the Washington, D.C., evening star on November 29th, 1906. I'll reprint the text below. As is generally known, Senor, many bad things are met with by night in the streets of the city, but this wailing woman, La Llorona, is the very worst of them all. She is worse by far than the vaca de lumbre that at midnight comes forth from the potrero of San Pablo and goes galloping through the streets like a blazing whirlwind, breathing forth from her nostrils smoke and sparks and flames. Because the fiery cow, Senor, while a dangerous animal to look at, really does not harm whatever, and La Llorona is as harmful as she can be. Seeing her walking quietly along the quiet streets, at times when she is not running and shrieking for her lost children, she seems a respectable person, only odd-looking because of her white petticoat and white rebozo with which her head is covered, and anybody might speak to her, but whoever does speak to her in that very same moment dies. The beginning of her was so long ago that no one knows when was the beginning of her. Nor does anyone know anything about her at all. But it is known certainly that at the beginning of her, she was a living woman. She committed bad sins. As soon as ever a child was born to her, she would throw it into one of the canals which surround the city, and so would drown it. And she had a great many children, and this practice in regard to them she continued for a long time. At last her conscience began to prick her about what she did with her children, but whether it was that priest that spoke to her or that some of the saints cautioned her in the matter, no one knows. But it is certain that because of her sinnings, she began to go through the streets in the darkness, weeping and wailing. And presently it is said that from night till morning there was a wailing woman in the streets, and to see her, being in terror of her, many people went forth at midnight, but none did see her, because she could be only seen when the street was deserted and she was alone. Sometimes she would come to a sleeping watchman and would waken him by asking, "What time is it?" And he would see a woman clad in white standing beside him with her rebozo drawn over her face. And he would answer, "It is 12 hours of the night." And she would say, "At 12 hours of this day, I must be in Guadalajara," or it might be in San Luis Potosi, or in some other far distant city. And so speaking, she would shriek bitterly, "Where shall I find my children?" and would vanish instantly and utterly away. The watchman would feel as though all of his senses had gone from him and would become a dead man. This happened many times to many watchmen who made reports of it to their officers, but their officers would not believe what they told. But it happened on a night that an officer of the watch was passing by the lonely street beside the church of Santa Anita, and there he met with a woman wearing a white rebozo and a white petticoat, and to her he began to make love. He urged her, saying, "Throw off your rebozo, that I may see your pretty face." And suddenly she uncovered her face, and what he beheld was a bare, grinning skull set fast into the bare bones of a skeleton. And while he looked at her in horror, there came from her fleshless jaws an icy breath, and the iciness of it froze with the very heart's blood in him, and he fell to the earth, heavily in a deathly swoon. When his senses came back to him, he was greatly troubled. In fear, he returned to the Diputación, and there told what had befallen him, and a little while his life forsook him, and he died. What is most wonderful about this wailing woman, Senor, is that she is seen in the same moment by different people in places widely apart. One seeing her hurrying across the atrium of the cathedral, another beside the Arcos de San Cosme, and yet another near the Salto del Agua, over the prison of Belen. More than that, in one single night she will be seen in Monterey and Oaxaca and in Acapulco, the whole width and length of the land apart, and whoever speaks with her in those far cities, as here in Mexico, immediately dies in fright. Also, she is seen at times in the country. Once some travelers coming along a lonely road met with her and asked, "Where are you on this Where go you on this lonely road? And for answer she cried, Where shall I find my children? And shrieking disappeared. And one of the travelers went mad. Being come here to the city, they told what they had seen, and were told that this same wailing woman had maddened or killed many people here also. Because the wailing woman is so generally known, Senor that so greatly feared, few people now stop her when they meet her to speak with her. Therefore few now die of her, and that is fortunate. But her loud, keen wailings and the sound of her running feet are heard often, and especially in nights of storm. I myself, Senor, have heard the running of her feet and wailings, but I've never seen her. God forbid that I ever shall. So who is La Llorona? For Camille, that was the end of the article. We're switching back to the original article we're quoting. For Camille, she is the, quote, the first concept of fear of many of us Mexican Americans have experienced. She is our anxiety's origin story. Camille observes, no two individuals view La Llorona in the same way. For example, the children I interviewed mostly saw La Llorona as a ghostly apparition, more than willing to instill fear in young ones who misbehave. For the young adults, including myself, there was description of La Llorona not just as a ghost, but as a monster, making us feel isolated then from normalcy. For my parents, however, La Llorona wavered from being a mother with the world on her shoulders to a key for escaping the harsh realities of life through ostentation. Every single informant viewed the La Llorona as a unique and personalized character in their own minds. And she makes the important point. La Llorona is not only a reflection of our innermost, but she is the living, breathing proof that we can overcome them as well. Her narrative, passed down for centuries, is a reminder that our voices are being listened to and acknowledged. La Llorona is understood more and more each day, and in a way, so are we. Really liked that article. These next ones are stories that I like to read. A little bit is from an article. This was written by Kathy Alexander for Legends of America in December of 22. So she says a little bit, and then I'm going to go into the reader stories that are also attached to this article. Quote, another story involved a man by the name of Epifanio Garcia, who was an outspoken boy who often argued with his mother and his father. After a heated argument, he and his brothers, Carlos and Augustine, decided to leave their ranch in Ojo de la Vaca to head toward the Villa Real de Santa Fe. However, when they were along their way, they were visited by a tall woman wearing a black tepelo and a black net over her face. Two of the boys were riding in the front of the wagon when the spirit appeared on the seat between them. She was silent and continued to sit there until Epifanio finally turned the horses around and headed back home, at which time she said, I will visit you again someday when you argue with your mother. Sorry if I keep saying that name wrong, and sorry if my audio has just switched. My mic is failing, has stopped working, so I do have a new computer, so it does have good mic and speakers and stuff. So just hang in there with me. I need to get this one done. So, and I'm sorry about saying that name so wrong. It continues on. It says, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the tall wailing spirit has been repeatedly seen in the Para Building, which is Public Employees Retirement Association, built on land that once was an old Spanish Indian graveyard near the Santa Fe River. Many people who have been employed there tell of hearing cries resounding through the halls and feeling unseen hands pushing them while on the staircase. La Llorona has been heard at night wailing next to rivers by many, and her wanderings have grown wider, following Hispanic people wherever they go. Her movements have been traced through the Southwest as far north as Montana and the banks of the Yellowstone River. The Hispanic people believe that the weeping woman will always be with them, following the many rivers looking for her children. For this reason, many of them fear the dark and pass the legend from generation to generation. So here are some reader stories that are associated with that article. La Llorona woke me up once when I was camping at Indian Falls Rapids in the Yampa River in Colorado when I was 15. I walked with her to a cabin, and there was a man in the bed. All I saw was his foot, but when she yelled at me to run, I did. If I didn't smash my toe on a rock, I would have run off the cliff into the Indian Fall Rapids. I saw an article in this month's Mountain Gazette about her and looked her up in the internet. This is from Brian from Colorado in 2008. This one's called A Kansas Tale. While working as a copy editor for a newspaper recently, I discovered a wire story about La Llorona that brought back memories of what happened to me while I was a student at Kansas State University in the early 1980s in Manhattan, Kansas, and led me to your website where I read more about the legend. One evening, I went to a mobile home that I seem to remember being near a creek or a river to visit a couple of my friends who were also attending K-State. As I entered the door, I found them sitting on the sofa, somewhat freaked out. They explained that one of the bar stools had been spinning and hopping around just moments earlier. As they were Mexican Americans, they wondered whether the La Llorona had anything to do with that incident. They explained the legend to me as I had never heard about it before. They would invite me to stay the night in a spare bedroom, which I did. Later in the night, a woman appeared to me lying beside me in bed and asked if I would know where her children were. While I may have been dreaming, it seemed that I was half awake. Then I fully awoke and looked up towards the doorway just in time to see a dark figure seemingly looking at me, then quickly ducking back out the doorway. Right then, that left me too scared to go check and see if that was one of my friends checking in on me. Perhaps I see why I was talking in my sleep or something. I went back to sleep and waited until the morning to ask them if either one of them had looked into my room. Neither did. So to this day, I do not know whether I really did experience a supernatural visit or if my dream and mind played tricks on me. So that is the end of that article. And then I just am going to finish up here with a little info. It's from ghostcitytours.com and they are in San Antonio. And they, on their website, wrote a little bit about La Llorona. And so just this little part will finish it up for us. So, quote, what makes La Llorona different from the others is that she wasn't some mythical creature born of the imagination of men. She was a person, a wife, a daughter, a mother of two, a flesh and blood woman with hopes and dreams and a family she loved. Simply, she was one of us until she wasn't. The truth is she never really left. Denied from heaven and bound to purgatory, La Llorona still haunts our mortal realm, a divine punishment for the lives she took. Her spirit, trapped for eternity, now roams the waterways, crying, wailing, searching desperately for her lost children, or any other unfortunate souls who might tempt fate and happen across her path. The legend of La Llorona has a complicated past, transcending the history books and transforming itself into the ghostly tale we know today. It is certainly not for the faint of heart, but has nonetheless become deeply rooted in popular culture, spreading past its Mexican borders as more and more reports of weeping women in white start to surface from all corners of the globe. What started off as a story to encourage children not to misbehave or wander off after dark has become a common theme in the public eye, reaching far and wide with scores of songs, books, games, television shows, and even featured films. It's had a long influence on music as well as including a Mexican folk song titled simply La Llorona that has been around so long that its origin is debatable. It was even featured in the 2017 Disney film Coco, the story of a young Mexican guitar player who travels through the colorful land of the dead in search of his family history. Regardless of how the name reaches you, through reputation or personal experience, one thing remains clear. After many, many years of whispers, rumors, and eyewitness testimonies, La Llorona is here to stay. So the next time you find yourself alone at night, walking at the forest's edge, the sound of a nearby creek trickling through the fog, remember to tell yourself that if you hear the sound of a weeping woman, it might not just be your imagination, and that death could be following close behind it. Oh, so scary. I hope you guys liked that one. I have I feel like I've always known about La Llorona, but I think it was really cool this time to really dig in and look at the legend because I did not know all about this. So that is the end of episode 45. Join me next week on the 23rd. So that is Sunday. It is a bonus Zodiac episode. We're exploring Taurus, the crazy Tauruses. And then next Wednesday, we are going to be in Michigan. Another really cool one that I'm excited to do. The research was very, very fun. So thank you again all for listening. If you'd like to follow me, I have an Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. And if you want to support the show, I have a Patreon. Other than that, if you guys could go on and rate and review, I would greatly appreciate it. I got my first 1-star review, but they were very right in what they said. I do not take offense to it at all because they were talking about, I think, episode 5, where I had no microphone. My research was all over the place. I was so nervous and I had no clue what I was doing. So I may need to remake some of those earlier ones to really put more detail into them. But yeah, if you guys could go do that, I would so much appreciate you, even though I already do. So yeah, join me next week on Sunday and Wednesday. We will see you then, guys. Bye.